Welcome, welcome, welcome back to our second episode, first season of the Post podcast. I am Coach MP, your host with the most. Excited again for another episode. I woke up today after posting episode part one and part two, and had so much love. DMs just full of encouragement and support and cheering and like, I can't believe you finally did it. And so I just want to thank every person who has reached out to me with a kind word, with encouragement, every person who subscribed and liked something or commented on something. I just appreciate you all so much. My Come Hither um, energy family has just been outstanding. So thank you all for showing up for me. I appreciate you and how you're supporting this pivot to a new way of getting content out and maybe even a more beneficial way. We'll see, as opposed to my writing. So we'll see how it goes. But I'm excited. I'm excited. I'm ready to get into our next episode and the topic. We left off talking about we got through the death of my father, a breakup. I'm back from Paris. I am in therapy and beginning to actually engage in the EMDR therapy that I had talked to you about, and starting to just do a lot of introspection and learn really so many things about myself. So, the title of today's podcast is Narcissism, the Gift That Keeps on Giving, the Lessons. And the reason why I am choosing to talk about narcissism, and we're not going to talk about it at length, is because I believe that it is the fundamental um, way or cause of my becoming codependent. So, codependency and narcissism, what I've learned, really play a little bit off of each other, and really, in a lot of ways, are one of the same dysfunction, if you will. So narcissism gets a really bad rap, and I'm going to talk about we'll talk about the clinical definition of narcissism, and then my take on how narcissistic personality disorder might develop. But the reason why we're even talking about narcissism at all is because of its proximity to codependency. And so this is a big part of my journey and what I am healing from. So let's start with with some definitions. And I don't want to get too technical. I told you guys, like, I don't want to show up in this space as an expert. So I'm going to give technical definitions because I think that's important for a framework of reference. But I'm then going to explain to you in my own words how I see these dysfunctions and disorders. And that's my opinion. So, not fact, but opinion. But we'll have some facts to start the conversation. So, I already looked these things up for you. And we'll start with the definition of trauma because I find that we have a lot of different and varying views about what even a trauma is. Um, and so sometimes that's why, when you see something happening in the world, some people might, look at that and deem it as a trauma or a tragedy, and some people may not, because I think our experience tends to lend to how we define those things. But the definition, if you will, of a trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And then there's a second definition that says physical injury. Um, Emotional shock following a stressful event, or a physical injury, which may be associated with physical shock and sometimes leads to a long term neurosis. So that really is consistent with how I define a trauma, which is, to me, anything that disrupts the natural development of the brain in childhood, um, And then anything throughout our lives that happens that causes us to have to causes us or our brain to have to respond and react in a way that might not be typical to who we are. Does that make sense? So, um, if I'm a super sensitive person, what I perceive to be a trauma or a traumatic event might be different than somebody who has had more substantial experiences with trauma, if that makes sense. So, one way to look at it would be the difference between physical abuse and verbal abuse. So, if I've been subjected to a lot of physical abuse in my lifetime, then I may get in a relationship with somebody who's just verbally abusive, and that may feel better, like healthier. Like it may feel like it's not traumatic because in comparison to the trauma that I had, it doesn't feel that way. But what I am defining trauma as is all of it. So the verbal abuse, the physical, like anything that requires your brain to stop, take a minute, and be like, to me, is defined as a trauma. So, um, yeah, trauma can be a lot of things. And one example that I point to when I try to explain to people what EMDR therapy is there's a case study where a child, like 2 or 3 years old, was struggling. Like every time they tried to put a shirt over his head, he would have a fit. Like he would have this tantrum, scream, falling out. But a button-up shirt, he was fine. But a shirt that went over his head, he would freak out. So they did EMDR with this child, and what they found was that he got stuck in the birth canal during the birthing process. So the trauma for him was being born. And then trauma lives in the body. And I will flesh these thoughts out and these things that I'm saying out more in subsequent episodes. But for now, um, I'm going to try to stick to the topic at hand. So, yes, trauma lives in the body. So even though he may not even have been aware that that was the trauma, that was what was happening, surely at 3 probably couldn't put that in a language, but that was the trauma. So trauma is a whole gamut of things. And I think because our world is becoming more accessible to so much information, we may be becoming a little desensitized to what a trauma is. So I just want to say, like, I don't I try not to engage in trauma comparison. I do that sometimes, and then try to correct myself because I feel like the way the brain works in regards to trauma is the same regardless of the trauma, if that makes sense. So, with that, I learned when I went back to watch those other episodes, I said with that so many times, and I don't even talk like that in my real life. So, I'm trying to like not keep saying that. So, trauma. And then I want to go into the definition of narcissism. So let's pull that up. So, narcissism is defined, and I even found an acronym to help us with symptoms. But narcissism is defined as preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, a belief that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high status people or institutions, a need for excessive admiration. Symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder are sense of self-importance, preoccupation with power, beauty, or success, entitlement, can only be around people who are important or special, interpersonally exploitative for their own gain, arrogant, lack empathy, and must be admired. So, oh, and one more, envious of others or believe that others are envious of them. So they gave this acronym called Special Me. So special me spells out these different symptoms. The S is for sense of self importance, the P for preoccupation with power, the E for entitled, and so on and so forth. So that may be a way that you can remember. There's also a wealth of information on come hither energy about narcissism, because when I first started on this journey and became aware that this is something that was impacting me, I dived into the study of narcissism so deeply, and I posted a lot of that information, so you don't have to go digging for it. You can find it there. I will say though that I got to a point of that in that process of doing all that research where I started to realize that there was too much focus on the narcissism, the other players, and not enough attention and focus on myself. So I actually haven't probably read or studied anything or looked at anything about narcissism in a very long time. Today, looking up that definition was the first in a very long time that I've even um, talked about it. But there was a time where narcissism was all I could talk about. Like like saw the world in narcissism and codependency. Like all the humans, they either to me were one or the other. So I have moved past that phase of life, but that was a tough phase because not only was I seeing narcissism everywhere, but I was calling it out too. So I could be at work and you could be acting in a way, and I'm like, you seem a little narcissistic. So now I'm, having problems at work. Um, yeah, it got rough towards the middle of that journey. But yes, I studied narcissism because it is my belief that narcissism played a huge part in my becoming codependent. So to focus on and stay in alignment with the intention of the podcast, the work of it, I want to talk to you about what I came to realize about myself in relation to what narcissism and being around so many narcissistic people taught me, and then how I overcame some of it. So, first, let me just say that when I tell you that I had a lot of narcissists in my life, and I tried to give you the example of, you know, well, not even the example, but I tried to explain that I, this was like every part of my life, like, um, because this was a personality type that was comfortable for me. So, for example, I might go on a interview for a job or start a job and have a person that I have to report to who is, who yells and is blatantly nasty or disrespectful. Whereas one person might have that experience and quit the job, walk away. I am triggered in a way to like work harder, to like stay at the job, because that was my childhood. So in my childhood, what I learned is that you have to work really hard for love. You have to perform. You have to minimize your needs and your wants. You have to perfect. Um, and you have to chase. Like it's a struggle and it's hard and to get love and validation back. So because that is the conditioning that I had as a child, and unbeknownst to me, and I think unbeknownst to my parent, even who may have been behaving in that way, um, the way that I learned to survive that was to become people pleasing, was to become, an empath. I went through a phase of like, I would call myself an empath, and then I would call other people an empath. Like, you know, there's stuff on Come Hither Energy about being an empath. I don't refer to myself as an empath anymore, because I feel like I don't. I know that I have the capacity for empathy for sure, but I also feel like a part of the conditioning was to be hyper vigilant of mood shifts and energy changes in a person. So because I had to practice that from a very young age, I'm good at it, right? So I can read people's emotions because I had to be one step ahead and predict what the energy was going to be on any given day. So does that make me an empath, or does that just make me a person who is hyper empathetic because I had to be hyper vigilant? So I question that. So I stopped using the term empath. Although I do consider myself to be a deeply empathic person, um, to a fault maybe sometimes. So yeah, I don't refer to myself in that way. So yeah, that was the conditioning that I had, and then carried over into my adult life in every capacity. My parenting style, my, again, like, when I went to work, um, my relationships, my romantic relationships, like, and I tried to explain in the last episode that it's not necessarily by nature of the fact that there are just so many narcissists in the world. I really want you to be clear that the way I was showing up in the world was attracting those people, and I was attracted to those people. So that's why there were so many in my like space. Um I don't have narcissists in my space anymore. Like, my space is completely cleansed of that energy. Um I do have a relationship that is challenging, but I learned to set boundaries, and I'm still, working through that. But it's such a different feeling now than it was when I first started doing this work. Um, so what helped me heal was the EMDR therapy. Um, that was huge because what that did was it allowed me to release cognitions that I had repressed. That's what EMDR does. And then because I could now bring those cognitions that I was repressing forth to the forefront of my mind, I could then process them. So what happens when we have a trauma experience is sometimes our brain, just like when we eat a food that doesn't agree with us, it doesn't store the cognition appropriately in our brain. So now, because the cognition is not stored appropriately, it's like a live wire. And then we're triggered in the world by this cognition that we don't even maybe have consciousness of, but is giving us all of this, you know, suffering, if you will. And to me, what is helpful is to look at it in the same way that you would look at a medical condition. So if I had a headache, I can take medicine to mask the pain, but there's still, like, what is the root of the headache? Like, what is the root cause of the headache? So um, you have these cognitions. Sometimes, like, you have a trauma, your brain interprets it. Sometimes they don't get stored correctly. And then because they're not stored correctly, anytime there is similar stimuli in your environment or something similar happens in an experience, you may feel triggered. That's how it works. Um, so EMDR helps me to get those repressed memories to the forefront of my brain so that I could work through them and process them and store them correctly so that I'm not so triggered. It's difficult to set boundaries with hard people when you're triggered by them. So the more I was able to regulate the triggers, the better capability I had in setting the boundaries. And it really was that way. Like, I really struggled to set the boundaries before I did the healing of the things that happened in my childhood. So that was the way that worked for me. But just to help you understand what I mean when I say um, narcissism had a heavy impact on me. Working as a school counselor really gave me good insight into the origin stories, I feel, of a lot of dysfunctions. So I was able to see like the beginning story maybe of how somebody might become later narcissistic. And what I found in my experience is we all respond to trauma differently. We just kind of talked about that. So whereas one person might have a trauma and their response is to over empathize and, um, respond in a way where they become hypervigilant. Maybe the environment, this is a better example. The environment that the child is living in, let's say, is inconsistent. So on any given day, the child can't predict what they're going to get. On Monday, they might get love, kiss, hugs. On Tuesday, they might get the shit smacked out of them. Like they can never determine what it is. And it doesn't have to be those extremes. Like it could just be subtle. Um, and I say that because there, I there are two types of narcissism. There's overt narcissism and there's covert narcissism. So overt narcissism would be like just blatant disrespect, loud, crazy looks, all in your face. Like when you see people who can't regulate and they're just, losing control. Covert narcissism is different and it's more of a challenge. That's the type of narcissism that I was gifted as a child. So um there's not yelling, there's not cussing, there's not explosions necessarily. It's more like psychological warfare. Um, so my response as a child to this behavior was more psychological and mental than it was physical. So like I might have had students who are coming from physically harmful environments and they may come to school and act out physically. That was not my situation. Like my experience in childhood, if anything, made me turn more against myself than act out against other people. But again, how we respond to trauma is different for all of us. So that was my response. Somebody else who is in an inconsistent environment and can't predict like what's going to happen next, their response might be to build a wall up, maybe to like escape into like a fantasy world where they are the king and they can crush these humans who are adults and, creating so much grief for them. Um, Maybe they disassociate, bury their emotions, deny their emotions, deny that the trauma is even happening. I find that students who respond in that way tend to become adults with more narcissistic habits. Because for me, it seems like if your habit as a child becomes to deny your experience, to deny your emotions, because if you deny your experience, you also have to deny your emotional response to the experience. So when that becomes a habit over time, you disconnect so deeply from yourself that not only can you not empathize with yourself as an adult, but you can't empathize with other adults either. It's almost like you lose your ability through that coping mechanism to empathize with other people. And that tends to be what we call narcissists. Um, so, in turn, what happens, what happened to me is I did not respond that way. I internalized that behavior. So I responded in a way that was like, I'm not good enough. Um, I need, and probably because the way that I survived it was to minimize myself, to be less of myself, to not take up too much space, to not talk too loud, to not be disrespectful, so in all of that, you lose yourself. Like you lose the truth of who you are because you have to show up as who you aren't. So, um, that was the challenge for me. I had moved away from myself so that I could survive and function in an environment with a human who I was not able at the time to just walk away from. So that was the way I responded. But for somebody else, again, they might respond by building a wall and disassociating and creating a fantasy and just being like, this does not even happening. So that response that we, like I said, may later as an adult call narcissism, my response, what we call codependency, are really very similar origin stories and really very similar symptoms. Codependence, I feel like we get a good rap, I guess, in comparison to narcissism, but really, codependence can be just as vicious. Like, because the thing of it is, none of it is authentic. Like, none of it is the truth of who we are. So you're always showing up in a space, in my opinion, in a manipulative way, because you're trying to be whatever the situation or the person needs you to be in order to get the love. So that's manipulative. Like, no matter how you slice and dice it, you can, maybe you're a person who, you cook for your man every night and you take care, you give him a bath and all these things. But if you're doing it not because that's who you are, but because you want to get that back, that's different. And it's beyond I want to, reciprocity. Um, it's not, that's not what I'm speaking of. I'm speaking about, I'm gonna go harder because you're not, to try to get your love. And that to me is a dysfunctional way of attaching to another human. But that is how I learned to love. So I have, you know, been on a journey of trying to find a partner in this life with a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation about who I even am. So that was probably one of the surprising things, is that as I went through this process of healing and doing EMDR therapy and learning about these childhood cognitions that I had repressed, I also started to realize that parts of my personality were really just habits of how I responded to the trauma. So, an example would be, I am an extremely entertaining person, have been my whole life, like the life of the party. I'm so much fun, and um, class president, homecoming court, like all of it. Like, fun, fun, fun. And I'm funny, like just fun. Often I'm also funny because I make myself at the expense of the jokes. So that's even more fun and comfortable because you don't have to worry about, me razzing you, because I'm just gonna razz myself. So all my life that's been who people have seen me as. Confident too. Confident, fun, socialite. When I started therapy after my dad died and started doing EMDR and learning about narcissism and my codependency and how I came to be, what I learned is that I'm the oldest of 3 kids. When things in my house were not good, again, there wasn't yelling or cursing. There might the re- there would be a withdrawal of love, of emotion, of communication. So the punishment would be through silence and withdrawal of engagement. So it could be completely quiet in my childhood home for weeks because somebody is choosing not to speak to the children or the people in the house. So As the oldest of three, I became an entertainer. Um, I learned to make my siblings laugh, and we had a good time and fun, and I became entertaining. And if I made jokes about myself, it would typically make the other human laugh. And then that was, what could help change the dynamic and the energy in the room. So I learned to become entertaining. By the time I got to 40 and I'm in therapy and I'm learning these things about myself, I'm realizing I don't even think I like entertaining. Like, I don't even like people all like that. Like, I like the people I like, but like a lot of people is a lot for me. But all my life, I was able to pretend to be a person who loved to be around people because that was how I survived my life. So I feel like what I learned is that there were parts of my personality or things that I called my personality that were really trauma responses. And once I worked through that, then I could get to the truth of who I am. Like, what do I really like? What do I really want? And that really, that time frame is an extremely vulnerable. That was an extremely vulnerable time frame for me because it felt like I had lived one life and learned that that's not the truth. That life wasn't real. And now I'm trying to figure out like and build a new life. And like my brain was like, girl, what are you, this is too much. Like it was just too much. It was overloaded. At some point in that early part of the journey, I started having suicidal thoughts. Um, it was a lot. It was a lot because I felt like I had gotten to a place where I had to bury my dad in the physical. And then I also had to grieve a relationship with my mom that I thought I was supposed to have, or whatever idea I had of what mother daughter is, also had to um, die because it just was fake. It just wasn't the truth. So that's a lot for a person. At one time to go through, to like grieve the loss of such a significant person, and then feel like um you have to grieve another person who's living. And that it became really complicated between my mom and I because the more I healed and the more skills I got, the more I could set boundaries. And that was challenging for her. It was challenging for anybody in my life who was accustomed to me not setting boundaries. And one thing I will tell you about codependency is well, attachment in general. Attachment is fluid, which is not something that I knew or understood. Like I always thought, at least when I studied attachment, that if you're codependent, you're just codependent. If you're avoidant, you're just avoidant. If you're, narcissistic, you're just narcissistic. And that one, but no, you can be codependent in some aspects of your life and avoidant in other aspects, or healthy in some, like, so. And I learned that when I went through the process of EMDR, and just I told my therapist, like, I've never seen this healthy attachment that you're talking about. Like, I don't even know what that would look like. And she said, no, you had a healthy attachment with your dad. And she's right. Like, we did have healthy attachments with our dad. But I also recognize that my dad was probably codependent to my mom. So in my mind, if my dad was codependent, I just lumped him in with the rest of us, and I wasn't really seeing the full gamut of who he was. But my dad did have healthy attachments to us. So I feel like, and how I would define a healthy attachment is just that you're able to show up as yourself and there is no judgment or, you know, like you can just be yourself. So my dad, we had that with him. But then he was codependent in other aspects of his life. I am codependent specifically in um, romantic relationships and um, supervisory relationships, because not all work relationships. And that's what I want to say. Like, I think there is this belief that codependents are just doormats and we allow people to walk all over us. And we do allow some people to walk all over us. But in other aspects of my life, um, I don't attach that way. And my mom is a savage, right? So, like, my mom can read you and put you in your place without yelling, cursing, none of it. Like, but you will be like, it's like a Claire Huxtable vibe, is what we used to call it when we were little, with a little more spice to it. But I have that gift. So yeah, I'm not codependent in all areas of my life. Like, I can I can rock with the best of them, but where I'm codependent, like when I attach and I'm codependent, yes, it is very much I am going to minimize myself and put myself aside so that this other person can thrive. So, um, just keep in mind, if you are struggling with codependency, that you may be codependent in some areas of your life, but not in other areas of your life. Um, I'm gonna get to wrapping up. I'm gonna give you a few more examples of things that I learned about how I became in response to narcissism or the trauma that I experienced. So, silence is a trigger for me. As I said, we were punished with silence. So, I struggle. I used to struggle with if it was silent. Like, so say we're riding in a car together. If it's silent, I will fill the space, which lends to being entertaining. I will also ask you 1,000 times if you're okay. Like, um, those are just habits that I developed in childhood. I went through probably 10 years where I disengaged from music. I don't even know why that's making me emotional. I like music a lot, but I just went through in a phase and it was not even intentional. It was weird. Like 10 years ago, and it's been 15 now, I had this little Honda and it was like my dad bought it brand new when I graduated from college. And I had this car like forever because, Hondas last forever. And the radio went out at some point and I just never got it fixed. So I would ride, and my commute to work at this time was like 45 minutes to an hour. And I would just ride in silence. And I didn't at the time know that I had issues with silence or that I was weird with silence. It was like, I don't know, the universe just helping me get comfortable with silence. So then when I went to therapy is when I discovered and learned through EMDR that, because I was able to tap into memories that I had repressed. So now I'm realizing that we were punished with silence. So then I was able to recognize that. And once I became aware of some of these things, again, I could work on them. The other just huge thing that helped was the EMDR itself and the reduction of the cognition being so triggering. So the silence, as I healed from that, wasn't as triggering. I also feel like whenever you can name something, that also just helps to heal it. It's almost like, I know when I was little, one of the things me and my dad loved to do together was watch scary movies. So I'm a horror film fanatic. Um, But like the exorcism and old school scary movies, you always had to name the demon, right? And I think that is true for my journey and what it's been too. Like for a long time, I didn't know what anxiety was. So I'm operating in the world being anxious and I don't even know that I have anxiety. But once I could name it, define it, I could better like learn to control it. So yeah. Um, I was a bedwetter till I was 13. Anxiety, didn't even know. My parents didn't know anything about anxiety. So that was never, I went through to so many doctors. I had like tubes put in my urethra, like horrible. Like that's probably part of the trauma. Um, because I was peeing because I had anxiety. And I recognize it now because whenever I get anxiety now, I have to pee. But because I'm an adult, I can go to the bathroom. Um, it's crazy, y'all. It's just crazy. So that's a little bit. A little bit. I have so many plans for what I want to do with this information and with now what I consider to be my platform. And one of them is I am hoping to create a 90-day relationship cleanse program. And in that, the first 30 days, we will deep dive into, narcissism and attachment issues and things like that, because that was an important part of my process. But it did, like I said, get to a point where I had to realize that I was focusing too much on tho- those people that I felt had injured me more than I was focusing on the healing that I needed to do. So I don't, you know, my focus is just different now. But that is something that will be forthcoming. So if you feel like I'm giving you information, but you're wanting more information, you can always schedule a coaching time with me. But email me, comment, talk to me. I love talking about this stuff. So I will, respond. And just also know that as we continue on this journey and me, talking and getting more comfortable, that I will be giving you more information um, and sharing more. So, yeah, but I am going to cut it here. And I think I'm going to take a little break. This has been amazing and rewarding, but it's also been a little trying and hard. I recorded 3 segments today, and something happened with each of them. Like the mic wasn't working or I lost, um, I wish that it was a situation where I just could talk because the talking I got. And it will become that. I can already envision that for myself. So it will become that, but it's not that yet. So the technical stuff gets a little heavy and challenging. And then that just drains me. So I'm probably not going to put out another episode until Sunday is what I'm thinking. So look out for that. And then maybe in this time apart, I will take some time to think about a schedule so that you'll have some consistency. And then I will be looking for your comments and your feedback, and we'll address and try to make, you know, take that into consideration and make changes as I see fit. Um, and yeah, we'll just go from there. So a lot of this like weird, when I get to rambling and thinking won't be cut out because I don't know how to edit. So bear with me, y'all. It'll get better, I promise. But thank you for tuning in to episode 2. I'll see you at episode 3. Take care. Bye.